They were not like any people that I had ever known. They were shadowy, dark-robed figures, capable of atrocious self-distortion. Capable, for instance, of growing up to the ceiling, and then across it, and then lengthening themselves head downwards across the opposite wall. Only their faces were distinct, and I tried not to look at their faces. I tried also in my dreams, or thought that I tried, to awaken myself from the sight of them by pulling on my eyelids with my fingers, but the eyelids would remain closed as if sealed. An unexpected house sound, something falling off the shelf, something moving out of the corner of your eye, or waking in the middle of the night to a shadow or shape on the wall. Even if there's someone in the same room blissfully sleeping or nearby blithely going about their interests, the feeling of being alone, of being exposed, to being at risk can't be ignored. And there's some connection with dreams too, as if a nightmare has stepped out of the closet or congealed under the bed. Lafcadio Hearn's Japanese ghost stories can be easily found collected here in this Penguin Classic Edition or in a reprint of his Kwaidan. But either way, what we get are some of the absolute finest traditional ghost stories. These stories were so well loved that though they were originally written for an English-speaking audience, they were translated back into Japanese, which is somewhat humorous to think about these traditional Japanese stories being published in English and then translated back. And in 1964, Kobayashi made the film Kwaidan, which shares the name with one of Hearn's collections and means Japanese ghost story or ghost story in Japanese, I believe. And it takes 4 of the stories that Hearn collected and fleshes them out, draws them out, kind of gives the characters more room to breathe. And we're going to talk about in detail those 4 stories and the film in a little bit. Lafcadio Hearn was an Irish writer who spent the last 14 years of his life in Japan. He had already written collections that dealt with traditional folklore and sort of Gothic-ish fiction from other cultures, but it was in Japan that he seemed to have found his most rewarding discoveries. While he lived in Japan, he met and married Setsu, his wife, which I think is sort of like a nickname, and she shared his interest in these ghost stories and enjoyed collecting these books of Japanese ghost stories. In fact, she translated many of them for him. She wrote a book, kind of like, I guess it's sort of like an autobiography, later after he had passed, and I'm going to read a little bit from that because I think it's, I think, especially for this Penguin Classic Edition, I think that there's a lot beyond just the stories, the sort of like little bit of nonfiction that Hearn writes at the very end of the story and the introduction that we get at the beginning, I think really are maybe some of the most rewarding parts of the book, which that might seem strange, but it's such an excellent accent to those because Hearn himself is just as interesting as the stories that he tells in some ways. So I want to read to you a little bit about the process that Setsu wrote about that she and Hearn would go through to collect these stories. This is a little bit longer, but this is Setsu's, I guess it's her biography or something that she wrote. I don't know if it's a true biography. He loved ghost stories very much and was always saying, "Books of ghost stories are my treasures." I hunted for them one second-hand bookstore to another. On dreary nights, I would tell him ghost stories, having lowered the wick of the lamp on purpose. He listened to my tales with bated breath and with a terrified air, and when he asked me something, he did so in a very low voice. Since he looked as if he were really frightened while listening to me, my narrative increasingly took on a life of its own. On those occasions, my house seemed as if it were haunted, and I sometimes had horrible dreams and came to be afflicted with nightmares. When I mentioned this to him, he would say, "Well then, let's take a break for a while," and we would stop. But when a story that I told him caught his fancy, he was extremely pleased. If it was an old tale, I always summarized the story first. Then, if he found it interesting, he would write down the plot. Next, he would ask me to tell the story in all its details, and he made me repeat the same story several times in succession. If I was going to tell a story by reading it from a book, he would say, "Don't read from a book when you tell a story. You must tell a story as if it were your own words, and in your own words, and from your own thoughts." Consequently, I had to digest and assimilate the story before telling it. That was the reason for my dreams. Once he took an interest in a story, he always changed and became very serious. He turned pale, and a sharp, fearful look came into his eyes. The extent of this change was extraordinary. This was the case, for example, with the story of Okatsu-san in the legend of Uriya Daki. My apologies, I'm not great with Japanese, which appears on the first part of the book Koto. As I was telling the story, his face became very pale and his eyes fixed. That was not uncommon. But on this particular occasion, I myself suddenly became frightened. When I finished telling the story, he took a long breath as if relieved and said, "It's a very engaging tale." Then he asked me to say, "Oh, it is blood," again, and to repeat it over and over. He then asked me, "How do you think she said it? What was the tone of her voice like? What do you imagine the sound of her clogs made? What kind of night was it?" He consulted with me about many things that were not written in the original, saying, "I think it was like this. What do you think? If anyone had seen us from the outside, we would have appeared like two mad people." So she would recite these stories to Hearn, and he would flesh them out and add details and sort of not really put embellishments on the story, not trying to make elaborate flourishes or turn them into full short stories. He tried to preserve the original story itself, but in its best form, and to sort of give it a little room to breathe, update the language and tone of the story to sort of fit and to maximize its intended effort. So Lafcadio Hearn didn't imagine these stories, but instead he is preserving them and elevating them and sort of cleaning them up, repairing them. And these ghost stories are a bit different than what we might expect. The ghosts in these stories are characters in and of themselves. They have passions, they have hopes, they lament, they continue on. They bitterly remember the wrongs they have suffered. They are more haunting than horrifying. There's a story of a beautiful young woman who terrifies all of her would-be suitors. A young man whose friends notice him sneaking out every night, and that every day he seems a little bit paler than before. A wife who plays a cruel trick on her husband's mistress. A man who must endure one horrible night to be free of a curse. A husband's promise to his dying wife. A samurai who goes to great lengths to honor his promise to be home again on a certain day. Or a former samurai turned wandering monk who makes a grim discovery in his host's house at night. The stories are entertaining without trying to be exotic. Though they're written for a Western audience, the Japanese qualities of the stories aren't played up or overextended to sort of satisfy a Western interest. There's a very universal quality to all the stories. Obviously, there is a bit of a Buddhist or Shinto sort of flavor to some of these, but it's never excessive. It's never something that I think only the most cursory of footnotes is required to really read any of these stories. Of course, as I mentioned, Kwaidan retells 4 of the stories. 2 of them come directly from the book Kwaidan, and 2 more come from other book collections. And I'm going to talk about the stories from the movie and how they appeared somewhat in the movie, and then how they appeared in the writing. So yeah, I guess there's some spoilers here. I have to tell you, Kwaidan is one of my favorite movies, and those stories are probably among the best, honestly, in here. Although they're not exclusively the best. It's not as though all the other stories are much lower tiers. But I think that these particular 4 stories that Kobayashi picked are maybe the best choices, or maybe the best to have extended. Kwaidan the movie is an amazing movie. It's very surreal and very slowly paced. It's a movie that requires your patience. It's kind of a bit of a mix of a movie and a play in a sense, because often, for example, the backdrop is clearly a backdrop to a scene. There'll be a scene of a dilapidated house that's overgrown, and the skyline behind is an obvious canvas. And there's some very unusual and surreal imagery. This isn't something that's like, we can see it now because we have such high fidelity TVs. It's nothing like that. It's more because this is on purpose. You're supposed to see that. It's an otherworldly quality. In fact, the sound in the movie often doesn't seem to be in sync with the film itself. It's very obvious in the intro where you'll get these sort of splashes of ink and water sort of swirling around and this pinging sort of tone come off, but the tone does not time itself with what's happening on screen. There's a separation there, and I think that's something is being said there, that this is some otherworldly quality. The movie's incredibly quiet in a lot of ways. The Foley in the movie is almost non-existent. There's oftentimes you'll see waves crashing or the wind blowing, but there'll be zero sound for it. It'll just be some very haunting music and sounds, but not the actual sounds of the film. So we're going to talk about the stories in the movie. I am going to talk about them slightly out of order. Two of them are particularly amazing, in my opinion, but I'm going to save one of them out of order and talk about that one last. So the first one I want to talk about is I think in the movie it's called the Black Hair, or the Woman of Black Hair. In Hearn's Penguin Classic collection, it's titled The Reconciliation. So in this story, a young man is living in poverty with his wife, but he gets the opportunity to sort of have success in the court, and I can't remember what city, in another city. So he leaves his wife, I guess divorces her, leaves her and goes to this new place for this new station to accept this new position and remarry, and he's sort of sick of living in poverty and leaves her behind. And he goes and lives there, and he does have great worldly success, but he only realizes later that he doesn't love this new woman, that I don't know if in the story, I don't think there really is much said apart from the fact that he doesn't really love her. He realizes he still loves his first wife. The movie takes the tone of the wife is cold to him, but even in that, it's shown that this young man, who becomes less and less young as the story goes on, is really sort of breaks his promise to take care of and love his new wife also, even though she is somewhat cold. So he realizes that he's made a mistake. And so after many years, he leaves his second wife, leaves his station, and goes back to find his first wife, to reconcile with her. When he comes home, the house is in complete ruin. And he's sort of walking through the house, having come home very late at night in a rush to get here. He sees at the very back that there's one room still lit. And he goes there, and his wife is there. His first wife is still there, just as he remembered her. And they talk, and she is very happy to see him, and he's so happy. And they spend a wonderful night talking and relating and making all sorts of plans for the future. And when he wakes up in the morning, he discovers that she isn't alive. In the story, he wakes up to the skeletal remains of his wife, and he flees the house and discovers that no one has been there for years. In the movie, he wakes up with a similar revelation, but does not escape, and has a sort of very surreal sort of sequence where he becomes paler, and his own hair starts falling out, and he becomes disheveled and older, all trying to escape this house. It's very striking. This story of this man who chooses a station elsewhere, leaves behind someone he feels is holding him back, only to remember later, when times are seemingly so good, that it's not worth it. The thing that he gained is valueless. that what he had that seemed so easily given and so easily cast off was more valuable than anything else he could earn through any station or with any amount of power that he could acquire. The next story, at least the one that I'm going to cover, is In a Cup of Tea. This one's interesting. I think this one's extremely interesting because it's an unfinished story, right? Hearn even says, I think he says it actually kind of great. Let me see if I can just read this little section of this. Have you ever attempted to mount some old tower stairway spiraling up through darkness, and in the heart of that darkness found yourself at the cobwebbed edge of nothing? Or have you followed some coast path, cut along the face of a cliff, only to discover yourself at a turn on the jagged verge of a break? The emotional worth of such an experience, from a literary point of view, is proved by the force of the sensation aroused and by the vividness with which they are remembered. There have been curiously preserved in old Japanese storybooks certain fragments of fiction that produce an almost similar emotional experience, perhaps because the writer was lazy, perhaps he had quarreled with the publisher, perhaps he was suddenly called away from his little table and never came back, perhaps death stopped the writing brush in the very middle of a sentence. But no mortal man can tell us exactly why these things were left unfinished. And then he says, I select a typical example. And he tells us a story of In a Cup of Tea, in which a lord is traveling. And he happens to stop along this little tea house, and they pour him a cup of tea. And as he goes to drink it, he sees the face of a young samurai smiling up at him from the tea. He's strange, and pours the tea out and refills it, and the face returns. And he does this a few times before he sort of says, well, I'm not afraid of you. You're just going to have me drink you. And he does. And thinks no more about it. He goes and leaves. And then later that day, he encounters a young man who approaches him and says, you dishonored me greatly. You were very crudely, treated me very crudely earlier. Do you remember me? And he sort of denies knowing him. And the young man starts to say sort of inflammatory things to him, and he strikes out at him, but the young man falls back and disappears. Later, retainers of this young man come and say that that this lord has caused their master great injury, and that he shall return and seek out repayment for this injury on a specific date in the future. And of course, the story stops there. Now, what I think is really great about this is that there is no ending that can satisfy what Hearn says is, what does it mean to drink someone else's soul in a cup of tea? But there's really no ending for that. And so you have to wonder, why include it? Why is it something interesting? Why does it still have power? This Lord did nothing wrong. He finds himself in an impossible situation and singled out for really no reason. This mocking face of the samurai in that cup of tea is the misfortune that any of us could suffer at any moment, right? The car accident, the cancer diagnosis. It's the thing that brings our world crashing to a halt. And that no amount of effort or money or power really have any effect or can help us in any way. It's just this thing and us, and it's inescapable. And there's an impending date when this supposed injury must be repaid. It's very, I think it's very much applies. We've all felt a situation where we kind of thought to ourselves, why me? And I think that's sort of what this story is, a why me. And if it had gone on to a conclusion, then I don't think that it would be so universally appealing. I actually particularly like that story. I like that it doesn't have an ending. Next, we have the story of Hoichi, which is a personal favorite of mine. In the movie, it's called Hoichi the Earless. In the book, it's Mimi Nashi Hoichi. Now, this is a story about a young biwa player who is staying in a monastery and who can recite this sort of epic poem. Sort of, you can think of it as sort of like that, like a sort of like a somewhere between singing and poetry recitation between two warring clans, one of which is the Hiki. This is a sea battle that these two clans had, and they lost, and many of them died at sea, right off the coast where this monastery is. And Hoichi is particularly good at performing this particular epic. In fact, he's particularly good at playing the biwa and reciting epic poetry. Anyways, he's very young, and the head priest of the monastery and his acolytes have to leave that night, and so Hoichi is left at the monastery by himself. It's particularly hot, so he sits outside to stay cool late into the night. And while sitting outside, a stern and very commanding voice calls his name, and he answers. This voice says that his august lord is traveling through the area and has heard of Hoichi's skill, and that his lord is sort of traveling incognito, and Hoichi must not speak of any of this, but that he wishes to hear Hoichi's performance. Hoichi goes with him and performs. Comes back extremely late. I want to say almost like just before daybreak or after daybreak from this. And this happens a couple times, I want to say. It depends on if it's this novel, the movie, or the story of the movie. But eventually it's discovered that by the priest what's going on. He says, these are ghosts. Hoichi is told by the head priest that he cannot go anymore or they will tear him to pieces. So they cover his body in one of the Buddhist sutras, right? So and that's that famous scene. In fact, if you look up Kwaidan, you're probably going to see that scene with Hoichi's face, with these Japanese characters written on his face, usually in his body. In fact, that's where the idea from Conan comes from, right? In the Conan the Barbarian movie, that's where it's taken right from this. And so these Buddhist sutras are written all over him, and sort of somewhat humorously, the priest is like, well, I have to go out again, so you're just going to have to stay here by yourself tonight. Don't speak. Don't answer any call. Just stay here and be quiet, and they won't be able to see you or detect you with these sutras on you, and so they leave you alone and they won't return. So they leave. And Hoichi sits there, and he hears this stern samurai, this ghostly samurai call to him again, calling for him, calling his name, demanding him. But Hoichi remains quiet. He sits there for a long time, and he can hear now that the samurai is close to him and says, that I must bring something back for my lord, who wishes to have Hoichi brought to him. I see his biwa here, but I do not see the player. I will just take these ears that I can find and bring them back as to show that I've done my best. And he cuts the ears off Hoichi, which unfortunately had been forgotten by the acolyte who was to write the sutra on Hoichi. And so in the next morning, the monk comes home and discovers that Hoichi is horrible, has his ears removed. And, he says, at least you'll be safe, but he's now earless. And it became Hoichi the Earless. And of course, later in life, he becomes a particularly well-known and respected player of the biwa. He's highly honored for his playing. And that's sort of how the story closes out. So I turn the camera back on because I think originally my biggest interest in, I don't know about necessarily reading the book, but in a sense in doing this video was because I really wanted to talk about the movie, because I really love this movie. And I didn't think that I talked about the things that I really wanted to enough. And so I wanted to come back and make sure I covered it a little bit better. In the movie, there's probably a sequence that's, I want to say it's 10 or maybe 15 minutes long. I don't actually know the runtime of it. That is all the backstory for the Hoichi stories. The sequence is utterly mesmerizing. And it features these two clans who have a sea battle. And one of them is the Hinki clan. Hinki clan loses, and they all perish. And it even goes into, in the film, also saying at one point that there is a breed of crab that lives on the shores close to where this battle happened that seem to have a human face on their back, and they're called hinky crabs for that reason, because they have this sort of like the sort of their backs are disformed in a certain way that looks like a face. And I guess they're supposed to be like the spirits of the clan, right, who all perished in the sea battle. That sequence is amazing. It's all done as almost like a play. It's all on these ships, these boats or whatever that they're on, but they're not much bigger than like a large rowboat, right? It holds maybe 10 or 15 people. Only perhaps the leaders of the clan who are out here at sea have the larger ships. And there's a wonderful back and forth that happens. I don't know that I should necessarily try to go blow by blow in the movie, but I do want to just talk about a few just things in this scene, in the Hoichi scene, and just in general in the movie that I think are just really interesting. One is that it's this entire sequence of this battle, which is 10 or 15 minutes long, has no sound from, as far as I'm aware of it, no sound from the actual filming. In fact, none of the actors even seem to speak. Okay, they all have their faces painted to look very stark, and so that their expressions are very easy to read in a very theater-like production. I'm not certain if this is a specific type of Japanese theater. It probably is, and I just don't know which variety or which type to identify it as. The actors, not only do they not move their lips or have any lines, but there's no sounds of their footsteps, there's no sounds of the ocean, there's no sounds of birds or insects or swords clashing or anything. It's just the biwa playing by Hoichi and him reciting the epic poem of these two clans battling. That's it. And it makes you appreciate how much certain sequences of that biwa playing like made up with the action, how the sort of flourishes can sound like a frantic, clashing of weapons, and how the sort of sorrowful notes mimic the Hinky clan knowing sort of at a certain point in this battle that they're going to lose, and not only lose, but they are utterly cut off, and that this is a final battle. In fact, one of the Hinky lords even knows that he has no more time, and he tries to challenge an opposing lord, to a sword battle, to sort of have a duel, and that lord jumps to another boat, jumps away from him, jumps away from the danger, and there's this just really powerful moment there, and that lord rips off his armor, just sort of bears himself to the archers of the opposing force and is shot down. It's just fantastic. I could watch that sequence over and over again. When it actually fades and goes to the story of Hoichi himself, the approach of the ghostly lord who comes to him is always sort of signaled by this sort of echoey biwa note or two. It's what it sounds like to me. This kind of ghostly sort of sound. And a lot of the times the sound in here, you don't get the sound of the wind, you don't get the sound of the ocean, you don't get the sound of insects. It's all in a studio also. So if there is a sound of a bird or an insect, then it's put there. It's not, these sounds are not sounds that from the environment that they let stay in. They're all added in sounds. And there's this, I have to think that is just amazing, where Hoichi is playing in the graveyard to the ghosts. For this particular scene, Hoichi has disappeared from the monastery, and the head priest tells the groundskeepers to go find him, go get him. And so they go to the cemetery, and it's storming. There's this massive rainstorm coming down, and they get to the graveyard, and the storm suddenly, when they get to the graveyard, seems to abate, and all the water that was running down the stone steps, right, turns into smoke. And and everything becomes quiet and calm all of a sudden, and it's incredibly creepy. It's so powerful. And then we cut to Hoichi, who we know is in the graveyard, but his scene is set in this noble court before all the Hinky clan, all before him, dressed in their court finery, right? Their robes. You couldn't play the epic all in one go. It's too long. So he says, "Well, what selection from there would you like?" And they say that final sea battle, which he begins to play. And as he begins to play it, it focuses on Huichi, and when it cuts back at one point, all the ghosts have changed, and they are no longer in their court robes. They're dressed for war, and they're all sitting and standing in readiness as they just stare at Huichi and listen as he continues to play. As he gets farther into the epic, at one point it cuts back to them, and many of them are on the ground slain, arrows sticking out of their body and slashed open in death throes. The generals, some of them still have the arrows sticking into their chests, are still sitting there, still listening, still with red eyes, red as in red rimmed, as in going through powerful emotions, right? Watching Hoichi, like reliving this experience as he plays. It's an amazingly powerful sequence. The entire scene is fantastic. I think it's maybe my favorite thing in cinema that I've ever seen. I just think that it's just that good. There's lots of symbolism as a whole in the movie with the color red. I'm just going to say that. The actor from Seven Samurai, who played the sort of head samurai in Seven Samurai, Takashi Shimura, is also in here, and he is the head priest in this part of the story. At one point, he's talking to the lesser priest, sort of like the acolyte, and he says something to him, and then he turns and leaves, and that priest follows him, and that priest rubs his head like this, which is something that that Takashi Shimura does in Seven Samurai. He does it's almost like an identical gesture from Seven Samurai, which I thought was really humorous. And also the two groundskeepers have this sort of very bumbling, sort of silly, like comic relief almost that they provide, which I thought was extremely similar to Hidden Fortress, also a Akira Kurosawa movie. Oh, and just one more cultural tidbit, I guess I'll just put in there. If you watch this movie, you might be surprised at one point in the first story by the noble lady who has black teeth. And I think the first time I saw that, I thought, why is that? And that's it was a cultural thing that they would enamel their teeth with black enamel, I guess, or something like that, and it would protect their teeth, and their teeth would last longer. And I guess it was also, which seems strange, thought of as that the contrast was seen as attractive. Very pale skin, and then it was like a very sharp contrast with these black teeth, and it was a luxury that only the very wealthy could afford, and also it meant that it preserved your teeth, right? If they're enameled in this way, then you're less likely to have tooth issues. So just a little tidbit, at least that's what I remember reading when I had researched this long ago. Anybody else wants to throw in anything else in here, go ahead, let us hear it. I mean, I'd love to hear more. I'm not going to provide a real detailed breakdown of the movie. It's not really something that I do normally. I do love this movie a lot, but I didn't do a lot of research into like who actually played the Biwa for them or any of the behind the scenes stuff. If you guys need this stuff, you need to bug Jason from Liminal Spaces. The problems that Huiju have are sort of the problems of many artists, where you get sort of the attention of and recognition that you've been hoping for, but it comes from maybe a source that you're not crazy about, and it sort of makes you question if you're willing to compromise in a sense, or that the people who enjoy your art maybe aren't people that you really want to play for, really want to perform for, really want to produce for. And then in a sense, there's a sort of injury that happens with an artist, right? There's a sort of injury that suffering that takes place, where it sort of takes a little of your own enjoyment of the art out of it because it's tainted slightly with these sort of unsavory people or unsavory patrons. I guess it also illustrates another characteristic of really great ghost stories is that the protagonist doesn't get away unharmed. In general, really, truly great ghost stories, there's always, like, the encounter cannot be had without some sort of payment. Something has to be lost. Some sort of injury has to be sustained. And the last one is The Woman of the Snows, originally titled Yuki Oana. Let's hope. Actually, I've seen this. This one has been done a few times, I think. It's pretty classic. And in this story, two woodcutters go out and are caught in a sudden snowstorm and trying to come back. They're not able to cross the river back to their side. And so they take shelter in this little hut that doesn't really have a place for a way to build a fire or anything else. So they just sort of close the door and hope. One of these woodcutters is particularly old and one is very young. And they fall asleep. And the young one wakes up to see a woman in white leaning over the old man, breathing on him, freezing him. And she turns to look at him. And the young man is unable to speak, unable to do anything to defend himself. And she looks very closely at him and says that I'm going to spare you because you're so young and because you're very handsome, but you must never speak of what you have seen tonight. Never mention me, not even to your mother, or I will come back and kill you. And she leaves, and the young man goes home, and after recovering, he goes back to woodcutting, and in the spring meets a beautiful young woman who is on her way to, I think it's Kyoto. And what I love here in the book, what the book does, and that she sort of asks him if he's married. He says no, and he asks her, and she says no. And he's like, well, it's too late for you to go anywhere tonight. You can just stay at our house. It's me and my mother. And she's like, all right. And I kind of love how the story relates how she doesn't leave. It sort of says, well, she never did go to Kyoto. She stayed as sort of a dutiful daughter-in-law. And I really liked that take on it. It does not say that they got married, to say that she stayed as a daughter-in-law. I really kind of like that. So that she stays here. Her and the young woodcutter live very happily together. She bears him 10 children in the story. In the movie, I think it says 3. The mother's last words are praise for her daughter-in-law. The woodcutter who's not so young anymore, is very happy. They have this beautiful life. They have this wonderful, amazing life together. And then one night, as she's weaving, he says, you really remind me of this beautiful woman I saw one time. And his wife says, oh, tell me about her. And he does. He relates the event that happened to him and the old woodcutter. And when he's done, she stands up and shrieks at him and says, you were never supposed to tell anyone. And she says, if it wasn't for those children over there, I would kill you right now. But I'm not going to, for their sake. But if you should ever mistreat them or give them cause to complain, I will come back and give you what you deserve. And she leaves, and he is to raise his 10 or 3 children by himself. It's a really, of course, I'm abbreviating it, but it's such a really amazing story. And of course, I've seen this done, and I think it was Tales from the Dark Side redid this, I think at one point. Really, really great stuff. So well done. And it's really fleshed out really well. This one and Hoichi are really fleshed out really well. It's sort of like Damocles' sword that sort of hangs over this young man, right? He sort of has this promise he has to remember and never to speak of it. And he's sort of maybe in a callous or careless moment, not thinking of how much he values his life. He says something or does something perhaps that puts all of that in jeopardy. And it sort of shows that no matter how comfortable and good everything feels, is that this really great thing that we might have, this really wonderful life we might have, can be taken away in an instant with a misspoken word or a misdeed. It can all be ruined that easily. There's this concept maybe of the woodcutter's secret, right? And then there's this secret, this thing you can't speak, you can't say because unimaginable misfortune might come to you. I think we all sort of have a woodcutter secret. Whether that secret really is real or not, whether it really would ruin things for you or not, is maybe up for debate. But I think that that's true, and I think that it's to some extent what's going on here. There's these promises that must be kept, and that we shouldn't be lax, maybe in our duties. Sort of take liberties with the people that we care about or with our life, thinking that it's that it's unassailable. Surprisingly, the most horrifying part of this book is not the ghost stories, but Hearn's own recounting of his early life and the things that he endured. He wrote very late in life, maybe about 3 or 4 years before he died, about his childhood. He was abandoned by his father and mother early in life and went to live with his aunt, who was wealthy. He was incredibly afraid of the dark. This fear was seen as a weakness, and his mother, I think, had a history of mental illness. Let me just read you what Hearn wrote about his early childhood. When about 5 years old, I was condemned to sleep by myself in a certain isolated room, thereafter called the child's room. At the time, I was scarcely ever mentioned by name, but only referred to as the child. The room was narrow, but very high, and in spite of one tall window, very gloomy. It contained a fireplace wherein no fire was ever kindled, and the child suspected that the chimney was haunted. A law was made that no light should be left in the child's room at night, simply because the child was afraid of the dark. His fear of the dark was judged to be a mental disorder requiring severe treatment, but the treatment aggravated the disorder. Previously, I had been accustomed to sleep in a well-lit room, with the nurse to take care of me. I thought that I should die of fright when sentenced to lie alone in the dark, and, what seemed to me then abominably cruel, actually locked into my room, the most dismal room of the house. Night after night, when I had been warmly tucked into bed, the lamp was removed, the key clicked in the lock, the protecting light and footsteps of my guardian receded together. Then an agony of fear would come upon me. Something in the black air would seem to gather and grow. I thought that I could even hear it grow, till I had to scream. Screaming regularly brought punishment, but it also brought back the light, which was more than consoled for the punishment. This fact being at last found out, orders were given to pay no further heeds to the screams of the child. That comes from his work Shadowings in 1890. He also describes in detail what a typical sort of nighttime encounter for him was like. It's too long to really read and recount here, except to say that I can't imagine enduring that a single time, much less enduring it enough that it can be described to be a typical such encounter. I think that if he had taken this and written it longer form and presented it as fiction, it would probably be among the classics of Gothic horror fiction that we still read today. Hearn, in his essay Nightmare Touch, says, "Nowhere do I remember reading a plain statement of the reasons why ghosts are feared. Ask any 10 intelligent persons of your acquaintance who remember having once been afraid of ghosts to tell you exactly why they were afraid, to define the fancy behind the fear, and I doubt whether even one will be able to answer the question." And then he says, which I think is particularly interesting, and this comes from someone who felt for a long time as though he really was haunted and suffered for it. The suffering that he had with these ghosts went on long into his middle years of an adult, and I think it in part played a major role in in his interest in these sort of Gothic stories and these folk stories and these horror stories, these ghost stories. I think it was a big part of it. Is sort of revisiting that, is sort of trying to work through it in a sense. So for him, there wasn't a sense of whether it was real or not. And in fact, he was experiencing something that, at least to him, was completely real. And so from Hearn, having said this, having written all these stories and collected this stuff, that's doing so much work, his sort of conclusion that he comes to at the end of his life is, which I'm just going to summarize very quickly here with this simple statement that he makes, although he does go on to say a bit more about it than this. So Hearn says, "Now I venture to state boldly that the common fear of ghosts is the fear of being touched by ghosts. Or in other words, that the imagined supernatural is dreaded mainly because of its imagined power to touch. Only to touch, remember, not to wound or to kill." That's it. I should also mention just something to know, that if you are a fan of current and modern Japanese horror, that I found that there was a certain flavor to these Japanese ghost stories that someone might enjoy. So if, for example, you like Junji Ito, I think that you're probably going to like Lafcadio Hearn's Japanese ghost stories. I think you're going to like reading them. I think you're going to find something in there, some similarity, some common ground, right, between those two. My name is Virgil, and this is Literally Books. Thank you very much for watching. Consider liking and subscribing if that's something you do. If it isn't, then maybe consider doing it for the first time here. Okay, so this is like the edit that never ends. I noticed that I had forgotten, or didn't really talk at all, about the film version of In a Cup of Tea. It was somewhat on purpose, but I don't think I never said it. So the reason I didn't talk about it is that I don't really want to spoil it. There's not a whole lot more. It doesn't deviate very much in the from the core story as far as that goes, although some of the sequences are extended. But it does actually provide an ending to In a Cup of Tea, which I think is really good. I really like the ending, although I still would sort of stand with my statement I've already made, and that I think that it's particularly good unfinished. And I still think that the unfinished version, as presented by Hearn, is I like it more, even though I really do like what the movie does. So there's that. Yeah, and again, this is like day after day. I tried to do I was trying to do like movie captures here for the, to show some scenes, although that probably would have put this video at high risk of being flagged or something, but I was interested in trying it anyhow, but it was just unable to do that. I don't have the, I guess I need to have the correct hardware to do it, and it just didn't work out for me. So, oh well. However, as a consolation, I did discover something interesting while looking at something else. And that mainly came down to this list that was made. And of course, I say this as though I'm all ready to talk about it, but I'm not, because here I am thinking, oh, what was the name of and I don't remember. And so now I have to go to the phone and look at it. The 13 Most Terrifying Horror Stories by R.S. Hadji. I'm going to say R.S. Hadji. I like it. We're hoping. It was published by Ron Sterling's The Twilight Zone magazine in between July and August in 1983. And it listed 13 stories that were considered to be the supreme of horror, right, up until that point. And one of Hearn's collected stories in the Penguin Classics edition that I showed is in there. And it's the one that's in there is Mujina. Now, I can't talk very much about Mujina. Mujina is super duper short, right? It is really good. In fact, when I read that, I'm like, which one was Mujina? And I was like, and I kind of read it a bit. I'm like, oh yeah, that was a really good one. It's just, it's much more of a, it's a kind of story you could spoil. It's a kind of story that's really good to be presented sort of unexpectedly. So, best encountered unprepared, perhaps. Anyhow, this hopefully is the end. I don't know if I'm gonna do any more. I don't even know if everything's gonna make it in there from this. It was a project. I was not well for a long time, and I had a persistent and unmitigatable cough. It was just, I think I still even kind of had it in the last thing I did. It was just I did a good job of concealing it or editing around it. But then I had like allergy stuff going on, and this cough was just like never ending. I still have like 2% of the cough left. I'm able to go for longer stretches without it bothering me. Anyhow, it kind of sucked. In fact, kind of is not the right word. And of course, that means that since I am in a long-term relationship with my wife, as a loving husband, my wife had this first, and she shared it with me. Always sharing, and that's what keeps us together. In sickness and in health, right? You share it all. Right? So we've been sharing the sickness part lately. We didn't like it. So production went way down to zero. And hopefully I can get, I had so much planned for Halloween, so much planned for October. Right down the drain. That's okay. I still have a couple things I'm going to do. And I don't even know that necessarily that I will let the passing of the 31st stop me. So, I mean, horror is a year-round, enjoyable thing. Everybody, you can enjoy horror whenever. You're an adult, I hope. If you're not an adult, you'll be an adult, and then you can do it whenever you want. It's like candy. As an adult, you can have candy whenever you want. It's like we're all eating candy when you guys aren't looking. It's constant candy. That's why we're so fucked up. No. That's it. That's it. Okay. So, third record. I'm out of here. Bye.